This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Gregg Hanzlicek, K-State veterinarian, kicks off today's show as he discusses rabies in cattle. He explains how cattle usually get rabies and what producers could see in their livestock if they have it. Keeping the show rolling is part of the Kansas Farm Management Association's podcast with Chelsea Plummer and K-State's Elaine Johannes as they talk about mental health with a focus on agriculture and rural communities. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, ends today's show with options for keeping weeds under control in the garden or home landscape. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about rabies in cattle with veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gregg, before we hop into talking specifically about rabies in cattle, can you just remind us about rabies, even though it's something we commonly hear about?
Yeah, it's an important topic, and rabies, just as a kind of a reminder, is rabies is a virus, and it's a little unique as a virus in that once an animal or human becomes infected, this virus actually travels through the nerves to the spinal cord, and then through the spinal cord to the brain, and it causes a brain infection is what it is. And it is 100% fatal in both humans and animals. There's been a couple humans that have survived, but they aren't normal because of the damage it does to the brain. So that's number one. It's a virus, 100% fatal. Lots of species can be, just about any species can become rabid. In Kansas, the carrier species is the skunk, but the most common wild species that we see in Kansas are bats and skunks both. Are there different variants then of rabies? There is. In the Midwest and Kansas in particular, we have the skunk variant. And so the skunk's a carrier. They rarely come down with the infection. They just spread it to other species. And then other species, we call those dead-end hosts, meaning once they become infected that they die. But we've got the skunk variant here. On the East Coast, they've got a tremendous problem with rabies. It's the raccoon variant. And then down in the southwest part of the United States and in Alaska, there's a fox variant. We're a little unusual in the diagnostic lab here when we test animals for rabies. And the only test for rabies is actually brain tissue. So there is no pre-life test. It's an afterlife test. But any positive rabid brain that we test, we're going to gene sequence that to make sure that it is the skunk variant, because we're conscious about the fact we don't want to bring in a raccoon variant or a fox variant. So we're a little bit unique in what we do, that extra test on every positive sample. And while we're focused on cattle today, you do test a lot of different species at the lab. We do. And again, it's skunks, bats, horses, sheep, goats, foxes. We've had a couple of positive foxes in Kansas over the years. As far as bovine, we've actually had 17 positive cases in Kansas over the last 9 years. And in some of those years, the cattle were the most common domestic species that were clinical with rabies. Most years and most Midwest states, it's the cat. Felines are the most common clinical rabies, but in Kansas, a lot of times it is bovine. How do cattle get it? They have to be bitten, basically, is what it is. And we presume that it's probably a skunk. You know, the cattle are curious. There's a rabid skunk, and so they're out there sniffing and smelling and whatever, and then they get bit, or, you know, it's hard to say. But it can only be spread through the saliva or through nervous tissue is basically the way that it's spread. So there has to be some type of bite in order for cattle to become rabid. Is there a time difference of how fast it could impact the livestock? Yeah, that's the other weird thing about rabies is that the incubation period, or the period from when infection occurs to when clinical signs occur, depends on what part of the body the infection occurs. So let's say a cow's bitten on the back leg. because this virus is going to travel up the nerves in the leg to the spinal cord and then to the brain, it's going to take a while for that animal to show clinical signs versus, let's say, a heifer was out there sniffing at a rabid skunk and it got bit on the muzzle. It's a shorter distance from the muzzle through the nerve tissue to the brain, and so it's going to become clinical faster.
What are some clinical signs?
Yeah, that's the really bad thing about rabies. A lot of the bad things, but one of the things is there's really no classical sign where a veterinarian or somebody will look at it and says, yep, it's rabid. As veterinarians, any animal that acts abnormal brain-wise, we're going to put rabies on the top of the list or towards the top, but it can start out as a subtle lameness. Some of the other things are sometimes they'll just constantly strain to defecate. They can itch. They can just go through this really itching issue where they're constantly itching themselves, scratching. They can hypersalivate, so they've got saliva coming out their mouth. They have some of these bovines in particular have this really weird vocalization. As a veterinarian, once you hear it, it's there. You never hear anything like it. It's a very eerie sound coming from a bovine that gives you somewhat of an idea that it's rabid. Aggressiveness. A lot of them are not aggressive, but they can become aggressive again just because it's an infection of the brain. But the probably the worst one is that they can act like they're choking. And that's where a lot of humans become exposed is because they got an animal, they think it's choking. Now they're sticking their arms and their hands in the mouth and down the throat to try to unchoke them. Well, the saliva is has a lot of rabies virus in it, and that's the way the exposure occurs. So long answer to there's lots of clinical signs, and again, the only way you can really rule it out is to actually do a test of the brain.
And focusing in on those cattle producers trying to save their cattle from what they think is choking, even though it's not, what should they actually do?
Well, if it's truly choking, they need to, at the very minimum, double glove, double sleeve, stay away from, try to protect themselves. But for an animal that acts weird, like it's just not itself today, and it acts like maybe there is something wrong with the brain, I would highly recommend they call their veterinarian. Veterinary students are vaccinated in school against rabies, and veterinarians will booster their rabies vaccine through their career and measure their titers and then get a booster if they need to. So veterinarians are protected. They understand the need for the personal protective equipment and what they need to wear. And so I would just have a veterinarian come out and do an exam on them and let them take the risk of actually being exposed to rabies. Humans do not want to go through the rabies series is what it's called. If they've been exposed, it's very, very expensive. It can make humans very, very sick. So prevention, meaning let the veterinarian take the risk, is probably the best thing to do.
What can producers do to hopefully just prevent having rabies in their livestock?
Well, we say that anything that has a name, any livestock that has a name, should have a rabies vaccination. It's extremely inexpensive. Any time that a producer has cattle that they're show cattle or cattle that they're around all the time and they're around the head, they're just monkeying with them all the time, those animals should have a rabies vaccination. And there's a couple types out there. There's a vaccine that's required every year, and there's another one that it's an every 3-year injection.
Can these vaccines be given to other livestock as well? Yeah,
the label is for just about any livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, horses. There's a couple vaccines out there that cover just about everything. And then, of course, we do have vaccines for cattle and dogs, or dogs and cats also.
So a great time to maybe have a conversation with a vet if you're thinking this might be something they should pursue.
The vaccination? Absolutely. And I would just think about, do I have kids? Do I have show cattle? Do I have show horses? Or my horses? I would have the veterinarian come out to my operation and I would vaccinate them against rabies. Again, it's a very inexpensive vaccine. It's probably the best vaccine we have out there as far as prevention and protection. And so it's well worth the time and the effort.
If people want to find out more information about rabies, what do you recommend?
Well, they can just call the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at 866-512-5650. and just ask to talk to me or somebody else in the laboratory.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
My pleasure.
That was veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. If you'd like to find out more information about K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory, you can do so by going to their website, ksvdl.org. I will link that as well as the contact information that Gregg mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Secretary Brooke Rollins as they discuss an eradication approach to New World screwworm.
The potential impacts of the invasive New World screwworm, as explained during a recent media availability by Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins.
The NWS is a scourge that is making its way from Latin America up through Mexico. And if it hits America, it is going to be absolutely devastating to our cattle industry, at the top of the list, frankly, to a lot of our industries.
The latest news on response efforts by the U.S. and Mexico. USDA investment in an existing fruit fly production facility in Mexico. Once operational, the renovated facility will produce between 60 to 100 million additional New World screwworm flies weekly. The sterile insect technique, as a form of eradication and population control, is currently being used in a similar facility in Panama. In addition, restrictions on Mexican live cattle imports remain in place, with USDA reevaluating that suspension on a 30-day basis. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of a Kansas Farm Management Association podcast hosted by Chelsea Plummer. Today, Chelsea is joined by K-State's Elaine Johannes as they discuss mental health.
Today, we are going to be covering the topic a little bit of mental health, and we'll talk about in a minute kind of the direction we're going to go as you'll find out there's a lot of different directions you can go in talking about mental health. But today, to discuss this topic with us that can be a somewhat difficult topic to discuss or dive into, we have Dr. Elaine Johannes on with us. She is the Kansas Health Foundation Distinguished Professor in Community Health. She's been a state extension specialist for a while and is also an associate professor at K-State. Dr. Johannes, thank you so much for joining us today. Just to kind of get us started, what types of issues or situations do you see farmers and farm families dealing with when it comes to mental wellness, specifically maybe stress and anxiety?
First off, 1 in 5 adults in the United States are dealing with some kind of mental illness or an experience. So that is a group of citizens, of people that should be and are getting care. And then 1 in 10 of us are experiencing persistent, serious mental illness. And so that often will be a lifetime of maybe medication, therapy, and support. Young people, 17%, according to 2023 National Association of Mental Illness data, 17% of young people under the age of 18 are experiencing some kind of mental incident or mental strain, stress that is over time. So that's a particular concern and group. But now let's turn our sights to just what you've laid out, the strain and stress, as well as the resilience of our farm rancher producers in the industry and in the family and in the community. And so when we think about that kind of strain and stress, there's some data around that. Just recently, Tawny Larson, Dr. Ed Brockish, and Dr. Cheryl Boyer did a survey of producer owner-operators in the state as far as their health and their safety concerns. And of that population, they did a survey, the issues of stress and managing stress in the middle of doing the operation of managing the economics in and outs, the commodities, making choices, the weather, getting the work done when our operations are bigger, larger scale. So Tawny and Ed and Cheryl did the survey, and yes, one of the primary concerns around our mental wellness, how well we're coping with the demands of the career, of the job, are around mental strain and stress and the uncertainty of the profession, of the career, and the uncertainty of making decisions, especially when you feel those decisions are made alone. So when a farm ranch family member are concerned about the operation, they often are concerned alone. The agricultural industry is comprised of people who are very familiar with working hard, managing self, and managing all these different inputs, be it fertilizer input or information input, and then making decisions. Making those decisions is a complex feat if you're having to do it suddenly and alone. And there are some actual biochemical responses to having that persistent stress. The Surgeon General's report on social isolation and loneliness from 2023 really unpack what happens when we are under consistent and persistent stress. Stress hormones get kicked out more frequently. We have a tendency to maybe have inflammation, which results in maybe cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, arthritis. Some of those actual physical things can be a result of chronic stress, but also aggravated. So you can't tease those apart. The other thing about being mentally stressed or having some mental wellness concerns is that it's a psychological thing too. The worry, the anxiety, maybe our sleep patterns have changed. Maybe our diet, our eating patterns have changed, and maybe we're more short-fused. So uncoupling the biophysical, the actual psychological, and then the emotional, and then it can come out in social. Maybe the person who's feeling these things or experiencing things alone on the tractor in the operation are isolated because they just don't have time to town. So being socially isolated from a community, from a town, from a group that we used to be part of, coupled with this strain, stress, anxiety, this soup of dilemma on the operation can really create this tearing of the fabric of the community, but also the tearing of how the producer, owner, operator, the agricultural farmer, rancher succeed. So back to this Surgeon General's report in 2023, there is ample evidence that there's difference between an urban anxiety, stress, being socially isolated, and rural. Rural because, again, just the physical distance.
This is a hard topic to discuss, but as we open it up, as we unpack it, what then, you mentioned there are solutions. What are the things we can look to for the bright side, or if we're the ones dealing with this, or if we're around people dealing with this that we see, what's the kind of bright side we can look at? What types of things should people be seeking out to improve on mental wellness or help bring that improvement to their community?
Yeah. First off, we have these kinds of talks, what you and I are having now. We don't ignore the fact that the ag industry is a tough career, but it's essential and necessary, and Kansas relies on it. So with that, we need to be aware that toughness is a physical toughness, it's an economic, and it's a mental, emotional, social toughness. So we don't ignore it. We talk about it. We do just what you're doing now. You open up the discussion. So when we think about the biophysical part of mental strain and stress, the psychological, the emotional, and the social part, there are ways that each of those can be addressed. The biophysical, if we feel, I can't breathe, I'm not sleeping well. I'm not eating well. My cognition, my thought patterns are more erratic. A first step is take an accounting of self. That's an individual plus also the family who is needling and telling the producer, have you gotten in to see your doctor yet? The psychological part of the equation, again, has to do with how well our brain is functioning. And it has to do with our biochemical too. So if we feel like we are forgetting things, if we feel like things are not going well, then tell a family member or tell a best friend or tell your provider, your healthcare provider. Get that checked out. And the psychological part can also be not only brain function, but also how we feel about our careers of being a producer. An emotional and social response requires the community. Back in 2023, there are 6 solutions, 6 areas that we can actually work within to improve our mental wellness, our social connections, and our likelihood that we will continue to be productive. If we can find a community and be part of it, then let's have places in that community where people can be socially connected. The other thing I think for the extension people that work in this area that is important is attending to social connection every time we meet. When we do have a meeting, when the church does have a potluck, when we do have a town hall forum, attend to the social connection happening, because knowing who each other are, knowing names, knowing context actually reduces inflammation. It reduces those kind of stress hormones that are bathing our brain, making us feel more angsty. It actually has a physiological calming if we know who we're with and we feel like we are with. If we pay attention to creating social connections, even if they're small, we could build on those. And when people do have a mental illness, or when people are having a question about their career, about the operation, they're more apt to reach out for help because they trust that they're part of a social connection group and a community.
Once again, that was K-State's Elaine Johannes on Kansas Farm Management Association's podcast, hosted by Chelsea Plummer. You can hear this full podcast by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Weed control is often an endless task. However, hand pulling, using pre- and post-emergent weed killer products, and mulch are ways to control weeds. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, discusses the effectiveness of these various control methods. Greg, we were just kind of talking about the fact that when we had all that rain, we quickly saw how fast some of the weeds were growing in the landscapes, the flower gardens, the vegetable gardens, and we really want to get on top of that.
We do. They are competitive and going to take some of the moisture away in drought situations. You know, it's important that our desirable plants get all the moisture that's available, and they're going to take up space, maybe do some shading of our plants. So it is good to manage weeds. It's an ongoing thing. It's not going to be a one-time fix, but throughout the season, we need to be thinking about how to control these problem plants.
If it's something that is on the minor side, we might be able to get away with just some hand pulling.
Yeah, that still definitely works in situations where it's not too vast of an area and very effective, and you see immediate results. And so this can be done. I might encourage you to water or do it right after a rain event so that they are a little bit easier to pull out, but that is still a viable solution.
So if you have a big problem, you're probably thinking that you need to do a pre-emergent at some point.
You can. So we want to start with a clean slate, if you will, because pre-emergents only affect the seedling seedlings, the young plants, as they start to produce their root system. And so you start with a clean slate, whether you did some hand pulling or maybe even some cultivation with a hoe, something like that. Hoe works for larger areas. We want to probably use what's called a scuffle hoe. It's a little different than your typical looking tool that you find at a hardware store. Scuffle hoe has a flat blade, and so that's going to cut those roots and the growing points off, and so you're not stirring up the soil as much, creating more weeds as you stir up the soil. So when you have a clean slate, we can put down a pre-emergent to control at least some of the weeds. Preen is probably the most common product out there. It's trifluralin is the active ingredient. It can be found in other products, but that's one most typically found and labeled for a lot of flowers, vegetables, and in the landscape as well. Read and follow all labeled directions on products like that is going to get you the best use of that product. And they do, peter out, so to speak, and so find out when you may need to reapply that.
So what about post-emergence then? When do we use those?
So if you have some weeds that are coming up that you can't control, whether it's cultivation or hand pulling, there are products that can be used to control weeds. Again, you're going to have to read and follow label directions. Glyphosate is probably the most common. Controls a lot of weeds, and it affects anything it comes in contact with, and so you need to be careful. Application or application equipment comes into play here. If you just can swipe product onto the weed itself, then you control just that weed and not maybe the surrounding plants that you're trying to protect. And so just maybe the application comes into play a little bit more than the product that you select. But again, you do need to have a product that's labeled for that use. Glyphosate can be used in some of the vegetable areas, and of course flowers and landscapes. And there are other products that are out there as well that can be used. Just read the product label.
And I guess one of the best ways to really suppress the weed growth is just through using mulch.
That is a great way to help slow down weed competition. Many of our weed seeds need sunlight, and that's when we stir it up with a hoe improperly. They come to light and they start to germinate. So if we can shade them, whether it be with growing plants well, so they shade out the competition, or areas that are bare ground, if you will, putting down we prefer as horticulturists wood chip mulch, something organic that's going to break down and improve the soil as well as slow down weed growth.
And we're still looking at about 3 to 4 inches?
Yeah, it depends on your soil texture, really, for good plant growth. So if you have a heavy clay soil, which a lot of people claim to have, a little thinner layer would be good for gas exchange for root growth of your desirable plants. But if you have a sandy soil, 3 to 4 inches, it's not going to inhibit that airflow, and will do a really good job at suppressing weed growth.
And we will see this throughout the summer, like you say. This is something we'll probably have to revisit.
It is. The products wear out, people wear out, but the weeds keep going. And so, it's a season-long management that you have to do. And so if you use some of these approaches, then hopefully it'll reduce some of that competition.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with advice on controlling weeds. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.